We continue our conversations with the 17 candidates on the ballot for Denver mayor. Joining me today is Kwame Spearman, business consultant, now CEO of Tattered Cover Bookstores. Welcome.
Cal, it's great to be on.
So you have described your general approach to leadership as this idea of ruthless pragmatism. What does that mean to you?
I think what Denver's looking for right now is a visionary leader. To me, leadership has two main components: an incredibly strong vision and the ability to attract top talent. And if you do those two things in a pragmatic way, I think you'll give the city the leadership that we need right now.
What's the ruthless thing about?
I think you've got to make tough decisions, Kyle. I think that too frequently people are afraid to embrace ideas or topics because of the fear of fallout for it. And as a leader, you can't run from that. And I think that's where the ruthless side comes in.
So all 13 of the candidates in our debate last week expressed a desire to see Denver move in a drastically different direction. Do you think Denver is missing either the pragmatism, the vision, or the ruthlessness it needs in terms of leadership right now?
I think the vision, I think there isn't a clear vision for Denver right now. I think one of the things that we saw over the past decade is as our city was growing, there wasn't necessarily a vision associated with that growth. To me, cities are either growing or dying. So growth is a positive thing, but we've got to think about what we're growing towards. You know, if you go back to 1983, when Mayor Pena imagined a great city, look at all of the things that we accomplished under that vision. I think we have a similar opportunity in this race, and I hope to be the mayor to bring us that vision.
You've described this race as a generational race in the way that the '83 race when Pena came in was. And I tend to agree with you on that. And I think the fact that we're seeing 17 candidates, of which probably 10 have pretty serious resumes, as an indication that a lot of people see this as a very pivotal, once-in-a-generation type race. What is at stake?
Everything is at stake, Kyle. In 1983, we had this opportunity to either become Cheyenne, and no offense to Cheyenne, it's a very different city than the Denver that we became. I think the question now is, are we going to continue to be Denver, the Denver we know and love, or are we going to drift a direction of maybe a San Francisco or Portland or Seattle? That's what's at stake. And I think the advantage that I bring to this race is that I'm a political outsider. I am going to stumble, I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm going to bring a fresh perspective to this field, and I think that's layered with being a small business owner. So the freshness of a Mayor Pena, but also the small business leadership of a Hickenlooper. And I think we're at a stage where if you merge those two things, we can have really, really positive outcomes.
The cities you critique there, Portland, Seattle, Chicago, Seattle, yep, Portland, Seattle, years of progressive leadership in those cities, and that's often criticized around the country. Are you a progressive?
I am a progressive. I'm a registered Democrat, have been, always will be. I wonder what the labels always mean. You know, one of the advantages that I have in this race, and that actually all 17 candidates have in this race, is you don't have to have a D or an R next to your name. If there were, mine would have a D. But I think we have the opportunity to actually look at values and actual policy ideas and just see what's going to work for Denver.
You've staked out one of the toughest stances against addressing homelessness of any of the candidates in the race. You've described unhoused people as exploiting the system. So it's going to be single-digit degree cold outside tonight. What are the people who are sleeping on the streets exploiting the system to get tonight?
I think the exploitation that I've talked about, let's elevate this to sort of give a full perspective on it. I think there are also people on our streets who the system is failing. And we've got to give more resources. We've got to innovate to help those people out. But there is another community, Kyle, and I think that community has grown in Denver, a chronic homeless community that we've become a magnet because we aren't necessarily enforcing our laws and we're allowing that type of behavior to continue. I don't know what the people who are sleeping on the streets tonight in sub-degree temperatures are going to do, and that's my concern. But we're allowing it to happen. You know, fundamentally, Kyle, I don't actually believe anyone wants to be unhoused. And so part of the reason why I've tried to segment out these two populations is we know people who want to get help and are getting help, but how do we actually get to the core for those who don't? And it may seem exploitive, but let's think about the mental condition that someone is in to where they are refusing our services. And if we know that, we can actually give them the help and support that they need as well.
Is that person exploiting the system? And again, the question is, what are they getting? What are they getting from the exploitation that you say that they're participating in?
What are they getting? Could you?
Yeah, you're saying that they're exploiting the system. To what end? To what end? I'm asking you about this because this is language that none of the other candidates in the race are using. A lot of people talk about their ideas to address homelessness, but you've described unhoused people, or some of them, as exploiting the system. To get what?
For example, Kyle, I was driving down Stout last night, and there was a homeless encampment, and that encampment had a giant barbecue pit, and they were burning a fire in the middle of the street. I'm sure that maybe they were using that fire to stay warm. Maybe they were using that fire to cook food. But Kyle, that is illegal, it's dangerous, and it's bad for our neighborhoods. The fact that they were just allowed to do that, and Kyle, I drove by and then I made a decision 20 minutes later to drive by, the fire was still burning. That's unacceptable. We can call it exploitive, we can call it whatever we want, but we have created a system in which we are allowing that to happen on our streets right now, and that's not beneficial for anyone.
Yesterday, when I had a conversation with Kelly Brough, she talked about the need to meet people with services, the offer of shelter, the offer of mental health treatment, the offer of drug treatment. But she said if push comes to shove and somebody won't leave the streets, that she'll have them arrested for violating the urban camping ban. Would you do the same?
I think the issue is not whether we are arresting people.
But that's
for
the
violating.
question. So I'd like you to answer the question. The question is, would you arrest people for violating the urban camping ban?
I will follow the letter of the law. And so if someone's in violation of the law, and if the law allows for them to be arrested, and a police officer feels in that situation that what needs to happen, then yes, they can be arrested as well. However, let me state a key point, because I watched the interview with Kelly. Great job, by the way. There's a huge thing that we're missing here. My belief is that the majority of Denverites are comfortable with us enforcing the laws. The area that they are not comfortable with is the equitable application of these laws. And so when I heard Kelly speak on that, I think she was missing a very key point. We've got to look at the data and ensure that we are actually being representative with our results. The biggest thing that I took offense to with Chris Hansen's ad was not the point he was making. I actually fundamentally agree with that point. It's that the images weren't reflective of the reality on the streets. And so I think what we need as a leader, and this goes back to ruthless pragmatism, it's not that people shouldn't be arrested. Kyle, we have to have consequences for our laws. The problem is that I think people like me, people of color, we know in the back of our mind that the application of those laws is not going to be favorable for us. And so we need a mayor that both understands, hey, we got to enforce the laws, but we also have to hold people accountable that they're enforcing in ways that are reflective of society.
So for folks who are not familiar, the reference to Chris Hansen's ad is an ad that Chris Hansen, mayoral candidate, put up in which he promises to crack down on homelessness and crime. 7 out of the 8 people depicted as homeless or committing crimes were people of color. Other candidates have asked him to take down the ad. With fairness, a difference between your answer and that from Kelly Brough on this issue is that her answer is very clear as to how she would apply the law, and yours is not. So let's try to figure this out. Right now, Denver's urban camping ban, somebody can receive a verbal warning, they can receive a ticket, or they can be arrested. The arrests rarely happen because the direction from the mayor on down is, we don't want to arrest people for this. What I'm asking is, if you're mayor, are you going to say, no, if that's what it takes to clear the encampments and get people off the street, I want them arrested, or no, just continue to move them along?
I think we've got to start with the process of how we get to that situation. The first step is we need everyone to know that we are going to be enforcing the laws. And I think that actually may change some behavior. The second thing we've got to do is we've got to give an off-ramp for those who want to go to shelter, for those who want to get on a path to having a home. And I think we have to innovate with our services there. We've got to have more segmentation. We just have to have better offerings. But yes, here's where I agree with Kelly. If no one is taking those opportunities, then we have to have a conversation if that individual is in the right state of mind to make proper decisions. I personally believe that what New York City is doing with what they're calling involuntary holds, I think what California is doing with the care courts, I think that is a step before jail. I want to be reasonable, though. There are going to be some legal battles about that, and I'm not sure on day one I can implement that. But I think that is a much better area to go to. But the last step, Kyle, is an arrest if that's what the police officer deems necessary in that environment.
Should the officer get guidance from the mayor, as he did from a potential Mayor Bruff yesterday, about vision of the administration, or are you going to leave that to the officer to decide?
The vision of the administration is that jail is an option, but it's the last option.
Okay.
We need to be leading with mental health services.
Yeah,
Right?
I think there's wide agreement there.
Sure.
In our first debate, you cited a survey from homeless advocates that you claimed backed up your view that most unhoused people didn't want to live in a house. But it turns out that you misread the bar graph. The survey shows the exact opposite. It found that the overwhelming majority of those surveyed did want to live in a house. It was their first choice far and away. So I guess this is a broader question about leadership and decision making. When you learned that the numbers that you were citing didn't back up your view, did you change your view, or did you go looking for other numbers?
So, great question. I think we should think about sort of what actually happened at the debate. I was asked, as well with all of the other members of the debate, if we believed the majority of people who were unhoused wanted a home. And I raised my hand because I do fundamentally believe that they wanted a home. The second thing that was brought up was this notion of tents versus houses. One of the things that we talked about, are people exploiting the system? Are there people who aren't going to take the options that are available for us? The survey showed that there were people in that community that tents were their top choice. The third point,
it was 18%, if I am not
how that's
mistaken.
1 out of every 5 person.
Correct, and you described them as the majority, and you were wrong. So I'm asking you, when you learned that the numbers that you were citing were wrong, and the folks who did the survey called you out on it, did you change your view, or did you go looking for new numbers?
If you could sort of let me finish, because I think the third point was the most important. What I said in the debate was that there was people who preferred tents to other housing options. Housing options, to me, were shelters. And what the data showed is about half of the respondents would rather be in a tent than in a shelter. So the two data points I think are incredibly relevant. And Kyle, I think this is sort of the point of talking about these real issues, is that almost 1 out of every 5 people on the streets would rather live in a tent than a home. And about half of the people on the streets would rather live in a tent than go to shelter.
What does that tell you about our shelters?
You know, Kyle, I met with our Homeless Leadership Council on Tuesday of this week. So Denver Rescue Mission, Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, Salvation Army. I'll tell you what, they're doing everything they can right now. And they've made a lot of improvements. So for example, our shelters now allow for 24-hour access. Our shelters allow for people to potentially be still reeling from the effects of drugs. Our shelters have available areas for people to put their things. On nights like tonight, you really have to question, if someone is still saying that they want to live in a tent over going to our shelters, I think we've got a deeper problem. And those are the tough choices that I'm willing to talk about as our next mayor.
So the numbers that you were citing came from the advocacy group Denver Homeless Out Loud. And after they and others called you out on this, and we fact-checked what you said, you then recast the numbers, saying that while you were wrong that most unhoused didn't want a house, almost half of them didn't want a house as their second choice. Which, again, we've talked about it, because the house was the first choice.
House
not
was
their
first
second
choice.
choice. Yeah.
Correct.
So Denver Homeless Out Loud, the group whose numbers you misrepresented, wrote to you saying, you are still misquoting the data, but misquoting it differently. Other candidates have reached out to those directly affected by homelessness, trying to learn all they can before they make your policy. They wrote to you, you grossly misread a report, got challenged, and still have not connected with us to get clarification of the data so you can be better informed.
So we have reached out to numerous homeless advocacy groups. To be clear, Cal, the chart that I referenced was a beautiful Twitter war on Friday. Denver Homeless Out Loud also acknowledged that the chart was hard to read. And I think what we've got to do is we've got to elevate this conversation, Kyle. I will always apologize for misquoting data, and I do apologize for that. I apologize for that. But guess what? What the data showed is that there are people on our streets who prefer to live in a tent than a home. Not the majority, and I've never said it's the majority. There are also people on our streets who prefer to live in a tent than shelter. Those are huge problems. And quite frankly, I feel like I'm one of the few candidates really talking about these things to Denver voters. There was a poll that came out this week that said something like 96% of people in Denver feel like this is either a crisis or a really bad problem. We are not going to be able to solve it if we don't face these sort of tough choices. And one of those tough choices is that some people want to live on the street. And what are we going to do about it?
So let's talk about the vast majority who want to live in a home. As was discussed in the debate, there's a gap between living on the streets and what we consider affordable housing.
Sure.
It's not always a seamless step, and that's very, very fair.
Totally.
But the goal is to get people in that direction of affordable housing. This is another thing that we talked about at the debate, and I wanted to kind of explore more now. You've talked about the idea of being a neighborhood mayor, more input from neighborhoods, their needs, as opposed to kind of the city as a whole. You specifically mentioned a couple of neighborhoods that you would allow to opt out of additional density and affordable housing, Hilltop and Park Hill. Wanted to offer you the opportunity to name more neighborhoods that would be exempt from having affordable housing or density, or maybe mention a few neighborhoods that should prepare for more affordable housing and more density.
Sure. And so this is where I am a political newbie. And so I don't believe I ever said that neighborhoods could opt out from workforce housing. Here's the premise that I think we have to accept. Denver is far too expensive right now. It's too expensive for our families. I'm the son of a public school teacher. I'm not sure that public school teachers can raise their kids in Denver anymore. And so what I'm supremely focused on is workforce housing. And I do believe that every neighborhood wants to have teachers. They want to have nurses. They want to have booksellers. They want to have police officers. They want to have firefighters in their neighborhood. And so I think we can collectively work with those neighborhoods to get those things done. What I've also said is that some of our neighborhoods are experiencing gentrification. And one of the ways that we can help those neighborhoods combat that gentrification is through density in their neighborhoods. The catch, though, is if we work with the neighborhoods, right, we can figure out what type of housing we need. We can figure out architectural standards for that housing. We can figure out what the AMI should look like for those types of housing options. And we can work in agreement with the neighborhood. I think that's the premise of sort of my neighborhood vision for Denver. We've got to go into our communities, understand what they're looking for, and then give our city government an opportunity to provide those services for them.
So you got pretty strong blowback in that debate from Mike Johnson and Leslie Herod in particular for what you had said about how certain neighborhoods are not well suited for affordable housing and density. Again, you mentioned specifically Hilltop and Park Hill. So if you changed your mind on that now, those neighborhoods are going to get affordable housing, they're going to get density?
Hilltop and Park Hill are not incredibly suited for density. There are tons of parts of the city that aren't suited for density. And here's why, Kyle. In a neighborhood like Hilltop, our transportation options are not that great. And so if we have a city that is unaffordable, and it's so unaffordable that someone doesn't have the opportunity to have a car, living in Hilltop is not a great option for them. There are other parts of the city that have better micro-mobility options and other transportation options that are better suited. Let's build those density nodes. One of the things I always talk about with density is if you took a helicopter ride, and I'm personally very...
Can we return to this? I just want to talk about Hilltop real quick because I want to make sure that we're really clear on this.
Sure.
So you're saying the reason that Hilltop doesn't need density is not because Hilltop is full of very wealthy people who don't want density, but because of public transportation. People couldn't go to bus stops on Colorado or on Alameda or on 6th. I mean, Hilltop is certainly ringed by lots of public transit.
I think that if you look at our neighborhoods, there are neighborhoods that were built for more of a, what you'd call suburban living. You've got larger plots of land. You've got less public transportation options. You've got neighborhoods that, quite frankly, were built for things like cars. Those are not dense urban neighborhoods. If you look at Capitol Hill, for example, that is a dense urban neighborhood. It is incredibly walkable. It's a high renting neighborhood. That's a neighborhood that we should focus on ensuring that the rent stays as low as possible in that neighborhood, and the way that we do that is through density. I don't actually think that socioeconomic factors play into neighborhood plans. It's structure of neighborhoods, what we've created, and what we can pragmatically move forward on.
You recently sent a message to Tattered Cover customers saying that you're taking a leave of absence from running that company to focus on the race. Did the company's board ask you to step away?
No.
They did not. That was your decision.
One of the things that I've tried to communicate to everyone is the seriousness of which I'm taking this campaign. And I think as people realize that I'm not just doing this to put Tattered Cover out there for a vanity project, that I actually have very compelling ideas for the city, we've gained more and more traction on that. And so that email was just to allow people to say, hey, if you want book recommendations, you got to go to our booksellers. You can't come to me anymore. I'm trying to be the next mayor of Denver.
The Denver Post and Denverite report that you were the subject of a third-party investigation over accusations of workplace bullying and discrimination against older female employees at Tattered Cover. Would you release that outside report for voters to see?
I would have to work with the board on that. The one thing I can tell you about that report is it was utterly refuted, and there was no merit to that. There was no disciplinary action from the board, and even Denver Post acknowledged that. Denverite acknowledged that. You know, one of the things that you have to remember with small business, actually with all business owners, is that there's a lot of frivolous things that come through. And when there aren't frivolous things, there are actions taken. And so the fact that there were no disciplinary proceedings against me, the fact that the report that you've cited is 15, 16 months old, I think demonstrate that, you know, there's a lot of noise, but not a lot of meat to that.
Were the complaints frivolous? Were the complaints against you frivolous?
100%.
Okay. Yesterday you posted about workplace bullying on social media, writing, quote, "Allegations of this kind must never be ignored. It's time to hold all public officials accountable, and I stand in support of those coming forward to share their experience." You were actually talking about a different candidate in the same race that was accused of workplace bullying. But I'll ask again about the allegations against you. If in your words, these allegations must never be ignored and that you stand in support of those coming forward to share their experience, would you commit to voters being able to see that investigation into your alleged behavior?
Not necessarily, because there was an investigation into the behavior by a third-party person, and the investigation was cleared.
We have to take your word for that.
You have to take my word, you have to take the board's word that Tattered Cover would not allow a CEO who was engaged in bullying his or her staff to serve in that capacity. That is true. You will have to take our word for that, but sheesh, I mean, that seems like a very reasonable thing to take our word on.
Last question. If you became mayor, you would become head of a huge city workforce that has some of the same complaints as what we have seen reported about complaints from the Tattered Cover workforce. Low pay, high expectations, people who feel like they're overworked, too much is being asked of them, not enough direction. Those reports described your reaction to those concerns as dismissive, questioning why people are stressed, suggesting that those who don't like it should get out. Would you take that same approach with the Denver city workforce? And what happens if you tell people if you don't like it, leave? Like, the city could shut down, right?
Sure. So Kyle, let's elevate for one quick second. When I purchased Tattered Cover, it was 2020. As you well know, half of the staff had quit over a Black Lives Matter tweet that was probably not the best solution. There were protests, there were petitions, the business was at the brink. Since then, let's look at where the business has gone, right? We've literally opened 4 new locations. We have created a children's store in Stanley Market. We've diversified, and most importantly, we've survived during a pandemic where so many other retail businesses have not. The way that I did that was through strong leadership and the ability to make tough decisions. When you look at where Denver is right now, we need a similar type of leader. I can't promise you that our 13,000 city employees on any given day are going to be 100% in support of what I'm doing, but I can promise you that I will lead with the vision and commit myself to that vision moving forward.
We'll leave it there. Kwame Spearman, thank you for your time.
Cal, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.